All right. So yeah, for starters, I could talk about the argument for panpsychism. There are a few arguments that usually it starts by arguing against physicalism. There are a few arguments which you already know, most likely, like Mary's Room, like Chalmers Zombies, Deontology of Spectrum, and so on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then usually the step which we use to go to panpsychism is to argue that there's a very elegant solution. If you look at the Deontology of Physics, it leaves a place for consciousness there, because there's a void in the Deontology of Physics. If you ask what is an electron, for instance, ultimately all you get from physical science is how the electron behaves, and you will never know is nature or why he behaves this way. So you'll know, well, the electron follows these laws, that's how he behaves. And even when you say, well, the electron has this mass and this charge, all you're really seeing there still is, well, because he has this mass, you can fit that constant in this equation, or that constant in that other equation. So even by specifying mass and charge and so on, you're still just describing the behavior of the electron, and ultimately you're never describing what the entities of physics in general are, and the deep reasons why they behave as they do. So the move then is to notice that this is true even for at the level of humans. A physicist could look at a John Vervaeke and say, well, this is this pack of particles, it behaves this way, and I can explain your behavior following these laws. I can predict it this way. But this is not really a good explanation, because it refers to empty objects, like I just mentioned for electrons. Ultimately, when the physicist refers to you as a pack of particles, he's referring to your behavior by referring to the behavior of particles, and he's not really explaining what is your nature or why you're behaving this way. But we do have at least a good candidate if we look at your consciousness. So when let's say you choose to talk to me this morning, we can refer to your desire to do so in your consciousness. That's a good explanation, which explains your behavior. And the physicist can describe this behavior, but not really explain it as well as when you say, well, I desired, in my consciousness, I wanted to do this. So you can make the identification of, at the level of a whole human, which you can describe following the laws of physics, is real reasons, is real nature, is conscious. So you make that equation at the level of a whole organism, of the level of John, let's say, and then you can extend this to lower levels, because it's a good candidate. If consciousness is a good candidate to fill the ontology of physics at the level of a whole organism, you could similarly do this at every level going down. So for your cells, let's say, which you could describe physically, a good candidate is to say that, well, your cells behave this way because they have a conscious nature, which explains all their behavior. And then you do the same all the way down to the fundamental particles of physics. So that's the basic argument for panpsychism.
Well, there's so I'll reply to, I think you made sort of three moves there, and I'll reply to those. There's also an additional move that I think is specifically relevant to me, which is you see this also as a response to the meaning crisis in some fashion. So could I ask you to speak to that as well? And we'll and then let me sort of I'll give you sort of my overview of a reply to your 4 points, and then we could do a back and forth discussion. Is that fair to you? Does that seem fair to you? Okay.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So I think there are two reasons why I see panpsychism as a good, at least, start to address the meaning crisis. There's first the fact that it makes clear the distinction between consciousness and matter, while at the same time inserting us deeply immersing us within the world. So let's say if your idea of the relationship between matter and consciousness is not clear, you can get the impression that maybe you're just matter, or maybe your consciousness is, if it's unclear that you're not just matter following the laws of physics, it can be very alienating. Maybe you're a zombie. It's hard to say what you are if you're just following the laws of physics. So that's the first point. And a second point is, I'll try to, I can make this point clear. I think the first point is to say, so we are not just matter, but still we're deeply connected with matter. Still, you avoid epiphenomenalism because even if you can say that, well, the entities that are described by physics, if you just look at it physically, what the way a physicist describes matter, this is very different. If you were to look at it just this way, that's very different from us. It's just an empty container, and there is more to this. There's more to humanity than just this description. So it makes sort of it colors the world, I guess. You can add consciousness back into the world, but still, this consciousness is not just floating around. That would be the danger of epiphenomenalism, especially regarding the causal closure argument of the physical. If that old physical realm described by the physicist is closed, well, even if you argue that there is more to the world than just physics, then consciousness is sort of floating above, doing nothing. So, and that is the second point, I think, that is useful in addressing the meaning crisis with panpsychism. It's that you can bring back your action in the world. You're not alienated from matter. You really do have agency. You can make choices and do things. So yeah, it's hard to split those 2 points, but I've tried to make the point that those are two things. So first off, you can distinguish yourself from that matter, but second, you can deeply immerse yourself in it.
Okay, so let me go through I'll touch on the first one, although you alluded it in your final point. So I take it that one of the classical problems, and I mean other people agree with me on all of the arguments, like the Mary argument, what's it like to be a bat by Nagel, the inverted spectrum, the absent qualia by Ned Block, all of those arguments work precisely because they argue that I could have two systems that are causally identical, but they could have different qualia. I mean, that's how all of these arguments work, right? So that you say, and therefore, because the A and B, Mary before, when she's in the room or when she's out of the room, or like, China holding up all the cards, but Bill with his pain in his head, right? Or the inverted spectrum, right? They all go at A and B are causally identical, because that's, but what you have is a qualitative difference between them. I'm
not sure about this. How would you say that in case of Mary's room?
So here's how, because the arguments are all arguments against computational functionalism. I mean, that's clear. That's the explicit target. And so the idea is, let's do the inverted spectrum, okay? The inverted spectrum is Bill and Tom have an inverted spectrum. So when Bill has the qualia of redness, Tom has the qualia of greenness. But the point is their behavior is completely identical, right? So no matter, if you point at an apple, they'll both say red, even though one's having the redness qualia, right? So their causal behavior is exactly identical. Because if their causal behavior was different, then you could give a functionalist account of the difference in the qualia. Is that okay? Yep. So there can't be any functional difference between them, because if there's a functional difference, then there's a functional explanation of qualia. Now, I take functionalism to be a causal account. I mean, that's how it's defined. So if they're functionally equivalent, they're causally equivalent. That's the argument I'm making. So the arguments all run off, they have the structure. A is functionally, therefore, causally equivalent to B, but A and B have different qualia. Yep. And therefore, functionalism can't explain the qualia, which you're calling sort of an inner nature. Is
yep.
Are you okay with that?
Yep.
Okay, now I take it as a consequence of that qualia can have no causal difference to anybody's behavior. Because if they are functionally different in all of their behavior, then I think by direct entailment, then the qualia can't have any causal impact on their behavior. Now that strikes me as implausible.
Okay.
That strikes me as implausible. It strikes me that that the qualia of my pain is actually a causal influence But then if that's the case, you have to give up the first premise of the argument. It means there is a functional difference between me having the qualia of pain and somebody that doesn't have it. So I think you're caught in a dilemma here. Either, right, that's how I see it, either you buy the main premise by which the arguments are generated, and two things can be functionally equivalent but different at the level of their qualia, and that gets you, I think, a kind of profound epiphenomenalism. Or you say, no, the epiphenomenalism, and I think we agree on this, the epiphenomenalism strikes me as massively implausible. Therefore, there must be a functional difference where there's a qualia difference. But then that means that qualia enter into the functional network of things. That's the response to the first point. I'll respond to all my points in general, as you made all yours, and then we can talk about each one, just so you have an overview of how the arguments in my mind are linked together.
Sure.
Now, so then the next move you made is a very interesting move, and so first I'll be well, I'm being honest with you all throughout, but I just want to be disclosing. I have sympathy for this argument, but at least some of its premises. And so the idea is, there's a sense in which science, right, is only getting at sort of the interaction between things, and there's sort of an inner aspect. Now, this is something that's argued for example, by many different positions, not necessarily a kind of dualism, or I'm not sure you're proposing a dualism or emergentism. We can get back to that. But anyway, I mean, you have, there's people who are doing work on this from sort of a Russellian monism, that the inner nature of things is neither material nor mental, because if it's going to be the inner nature, it has to resist both of those categories. And that's kind of going back to a Spinoza a way of talking about it. Then there's people, like I say, like Harman from object-oriented ontology, that says everything, every object withdraws, in a sense, in that no matter what we know about it, there is much more that's always beyond what we can. And I would put that in terms that I use in the course, right? That we only select sort of a subset of relevant properties of the combinatorially explosive set of properties available to us. And I want to be clear, because I think this is actually something that is supportive of some aspects of your position. I think that moreness is not just a quantitative moreness, more of the same kind of properties, because the history of science shows, even within the history of science, that moreness is also a qualitative moreness, new kinds of properties that we had not conceived of or thought of before. And I'm in a lot of sympathy with that idea that there's that sort of, see, I prefer that, because I don't like the sort of the Kantian notion of the thing in itself, for all kinds of post-Kantian arguments, Hegelian arguments against that. But if you'll allow me a turn of phrase, I think Harman's notion is the thing beyond itself that we never fully capture, and we never can. It's a deep kind of notion that we're always bounded and framing when we're relating to new objects, and I think that's correct. And so the first one I don't know about. I have to read more of the Russellian, Russellian monism, right, which is an argument, I think, sort of, that ultimately goes back to Spinoza, that says, no, you need something deeper than these two things to be the ultimate hidden nature, or you don't have anything that ground. The ultimate hidden nature ultimately has to ground the relationship between matter and mind, and therefore it can neither be matter nor mind. And so you get an argument sort of like that. The Harman one says, right, like it's a different kind of inner nature or beyondedness. It's like, well, it's quantitatively, qualitatively more, but that doesn't allow me to say specifically what type or kind of thing it is, precisely because the qualitatively undiscovered properties are going to change what kind of thing or what kind of entity I say it is. So I'm in a lot of sympathy with those. Those are arguments I understand how you might get to. Now, if what you mean are those, I have an understanding of what you mean by inner nature. If you mean something other than that, if you mean something that is perpetually inaccessible to science, then I would need also an argument as to how that differs from the previous two ways of getting at what's the distinguishing difference. And then I also have another request, which is, well, if this inner nature is inaccessible to science, I need to give why it's not inaccessible to me to core. I mean, what special fact to me in total?
Okay.
Right. What special ability do I have such that I can access the inner natures of things that is not? I mean, it's certainly not introspection. Introspection is deeply fallible. I mean, I'm a psychologist. People introspect and make mistakes about their inner processes all the time. And so I don't attribute any certainty or lack of fallibility to introspection. So I'm not quite sure what that inner thing is. Now, one thing that it might be, and so I'm not attributing this to you. I'm not attributing this to you, but I'm just thinking it through. And then this goes to your third point of like if I have a good candidate at the upper level, it would be a good candidate all the way down. I'm not so sure about that argument, because there's a version of panpsychism, at least a kind of panpsychism, I would say, that I'm very much in support of, and this is the deep continuity hypothesis. So people like Evan Thompson and others, and it works precisely by saying, cognition shares necessary but not sufficient features with life. Life shares necessary but not sufficient features with being self-organizing thing, and self-organizing things share necessary but not sufficient features with dynamic processes in the environment, right? And so the idea there is I can say, often importantly, what's the same, but I also can say, which is I think also important, what's different. So I can explain why living things like paramecium don't have intelligence, for example, perhaps, because they lack a whole set of property. And therefore, that version doesn't face a problem that I think more standard versions of panpsychism, which is, well, I don't see how you've solved the problem. The original problem was, how does something like matter give rise to something like mind, where I take mind to be consciousness and intelligence, at least as those terms are normally used. And now what it seems like you've traded that for another problem that to me seems equally difficult, which is, at the level of, I don't know, let's say molecules, the level of mind there is certainly not a level of mind demonstrating any evidence for what I would call my sense of consciousness having an inner space, a self-awareness, a subjectivity. Certainly doesn't have anything remotely like my degree of intelligence. So now I have the difficult problem, it seems to me, of explaining how the mental properties in the things that seem non-conscious and non-intelligent give rise to consciousness and intelligence. And I don't see how that's any different than how do the material properties give rise to consciousness, intelligence. And then that leads me, I guess, to my response to your fourth point, which is, I don't see why the existence of mental properties gives us a response to the meaning crisis. I mean, despair itself is a mental property. Perhaps all, I'm not foisting ridiculous. I'm just asking you to consider as a thought experiment. Perhaps all the micro minds are all in perpetual despair out there. They would have mental properties, they'd have consciousness, but that's no solution to the meaning crisis for me. Perhaps and then I think what the pivot of your argument, or the central point, is it gives us a kind of connectedness. And I think that's the important issue. But then I would go back to say, the connectedness I'm needing, right, I think is given by the deep continuity hypothesis, because the deep continuity hypothesis gives me participatory knowing. See, I know what it is like to be a living thing, because I am a living thing. I know what it's like to be a self-organizing thing. I know what it's like to be, a sort of ultimately integrated, unified. I mean, I have all kinds of things that I am, and there's a deep continuity, and therefore I don't just know those, I don't know what it's like to be a living thing just as you would put it from the outside. I participate in being alive, and that actually allows me to know it in a way no non-living thing could. So I think the deep continuity hypothesis gives me deep contact down to very deep levels of reality. And I think if that's, which it seemed to me, maybe I'm wrong, was the linchpin of how I get a response to the meaning crisis, it seems like all I need is something like deep continuity to address that. So that was a lot, but I let you sort of present all of your positions, and I presented all. I think it's good if we both get all our sort of the overall picture both out, and then we can so that we don't misattribute to each other, because the parts are always in a relationship to the whole, and so thank you for listening, and I hope you felt that I listened to you fairly. Yeah. And so that would be the set of responses I would give. Okay. Now let's be clear. I'm ultimately most I mean, as a cognitive scientist, I'm interested in all 4 points, but with respect to the series, it's the fourth point that really is the main one for me.
Okay. now I'm kind of torn because I didn't, give all my arguments for panpsychism, and now I hesitate that maybe I should state them before responding to your points, or maybe because if you really want to get the whole picture, then I should give my whole picture as well.
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, we both probably have more arguments in our pockets, and I'm happy to do that. So let's do it. We could, but now that we both at least have an overarching sense of where we're at, let's do it now, piece by piece. You can give a particular argument, and then I'll respond to that argument. So we both presented, let's call it our positions, and now we can get into, an argument by argument.
Okay, so I'll just address your points directly instead of talking about my other arguments. Okay, so I'll come back to your first point, which was basically the causal closure argument as given by Jae-Gwon Kim. So the issue is that I'm going to try to restate the point to both remember it and ensure I understood it correctly before I respond. So because the physical world is causally closed because we have physical laws for explaining what happens physically. If we say that there are two physical systems or two functional systems, as you said, which are different, which are physically the same but which have different qualia, then that would mean that the qualia are epiphenomenal. There are sort of two things I want to say about this. First, generally, if you read people like Chalmers, you will say that this scenario where two things are physically the same but phenomenally different is a metaphysical possibility, but not a natural possibility. Meaning that in our world, to a certain physical organization, there is only one qualitative state possible. But it's possible that in another world, the qualia are different for a same physical entity. I should restate that. Meaning that in our world, for a certain physical organization, there is, let's say, a certain qualitative organization on it. But it's possible that in other world with the same physical organization, the phenomenal organization is different from our own. But so the idea is to establish a metaphysical distinction between physics or functions and qualia, but still to say that in our world, there is a deep correspondence between qualia and functions. And this, in practice, what happens is that the qualia in our world sort of fill up the functional the functional organization. So because you can't just have the empty ontology of physics, which I talked about. You need something to fill those entities, and you use qualia to fill those entities. So this gives actually the causal power to the qualia, and
filling it up gives it the causal power to the qualia. It's in what way? Sorry.
So what I mean is, it will be clearer if I take a precise example. So
okay, let's do that. That would help.
Let's say you get up to grab some coffee. So you have a certain functional organization, in your brain, your body, and your whole environment, which could be used to explain why you moved to get the coffee. And now the claim, which let's say Chalmers and anti-physicalists will say that, well, it's possible that for this functional organization, in a different world, you could have the same functional organization, but the qualia would be different over it. So you have when you in our world have this functional organization where you want to get up and grab some coffee, you have certain desires, a bunch of qualia in your mind at this moment. But in the other possible world, you could have the same functional organization, but where let's say the desire is slightly different, or maybe the colors are inversed or something. You have the qualia are different in that world.
But so let me make sure I understand you. But the functional organization is still the same in the other possible world.
Yeah.
So the difference in the qualia makes no difference to the functional organization.
Well, from one world to another, yes.
How? The functional organization is the same in both worlds.
Yeah.
So if it's the same, it's not making any difference to functional organization.
Well, from one world to another, but you need. I'm trying to get a good image of saying it, but because you need in a given world, you do need the functional organization to be instantiated by something. You need something to embody the structure. If you can just have, because it's quite abstract. If you talk of just the functional organization, it's maybe
but embodiment is a functional property. So you don't mean embodiment, you mean something more metaphysical, like instantiation, or something like that. But what I'm saying is, so the instantiation doesn't seem to be making a difference, and I think that's important because the arguments, like the explanatory gap arguments, all require as a premise that there is never any functional difference between the two people, right? In all possible worlds, they're functionally equivalent. Because if I can find a possible world where they're functionally different, that breaks the argument, because then I can say, the qualia makes a functional difference, so therefore the qualia fits into because that's how you fit into functionalism. If you make a functional difference, you're part of a functional system, right? That's definitional. So I take it that it's a logical necessity of the argument that in all possible worlds, the two individuals are functionally identical. That's presupposed by the argument. I'm not saying it's presupposed by your metaphysics. I'm saying the argument needs that, because if there's possible worlds where there's a functional difference that tracks the qualia difference, then there is a possible functional explanation for the difference. Are we in agreement with that?
Yeah. Okay. That's what happened. So you really do need to say that they're always the same. And maybe, and actually I think there's a way to make your point very salient. If you take, what's it called already? The paradox of phenomenal judgment. I think that's a good point because I'm not even really that committed to the idea that I think, all the four arguments, let's say if you take Mary's room, the Quillian version, and all those arguments, I think those are very good to show that there's
there's actually five.
Which one did you add?
There's Mary's room, there's What's It Like to Be a Bat, there's the inverted spectrum,
there's zombies,
the zombies, and the absent qualia of Ned Block.
Okay, I don't know that last one.
I'll give it to you.
Sure.
It might be useful to you. Block says, imagine the following: while you're, he chooses the Chinese government. It's always the Chinese government, China, right? And in the middle of the night, they come in and they put you into a state of pain, and then they have this machine that precisely maps all the levels of activation in your brain. And then for reasons known to them, they go and they get all the people in China. You sort of have to get a conceit that the population of China is more than just a billion, it's several billions or something like that. And what I do is I get them to completely map your state. What they do is hold up zeros and ones, right, for firing or not firing, and they create a completely isomorphic pattern, right, to your brain state. And then Block says, is there pain anywhere?
Okay.
All of this, and the idea is no. But when people say, well, you're just holding up cards. And then what I do is I make the cards holding up launch missiles or send signals to ships. So I give it a functional power. And then what he's saying is they're functionally equivalent, but while you're in pain, right, China isn't, right?
Okay, But so to come back to the point, it's that's one of the things I do in my master's. I try to, I look at Chalmers' position.
Sure.
And I try to see.
Well, let's I just want to put a pin. I want to talk about Chalmers' position independent of this argument, because I think Chalmers' point is a little bit different. But let's go ahead. But go ahead, please.
Okay. Because all of those arguments, I think they can lead to a deep problem, which you alluded to, the epiphenomenalism issue. And I think you can. I get two problems I find which make this problem really serious. There's the problem of the phenomenal judgments, and also the problem of the evolution of consciousness. I think those are two big problems.
Sure.
The first one is more well known. So the paradox of phenomenal judgment is that, let's say, if it's just the functional organization, which matters, especially if you think that zombies are metaphysically possible, like Chalmers does.
Which means, by the way, there's a logically possible world where the two individuals are identical and there's no qualia.
Yeah. So, and that's a big issue, because in that world, Chalmers is still writing books and articles defending the idea that he's not a zombie, and
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. That's the paradox you're leading to. Yes.
Yeah. That's a big issue, and it can even be worse. There's another idea, which is to make the inversions more problematic. So even more than just having no qualia, maybe in that world, when people experience pleasure, they're really once they say they experience pleasure, they're experiencing pain and vice versa. And you can get very deep paradoxes if you don't really know the link between qualia and functional organizations. And the other deep issue is the problem of the evolution of consciousness. Because if you look at consciousness, it's just way too complex to be a side effect, to be epiphenomenal. And if you think that the consciousness is sort of piggyback riding on the evolution of functional organizations, then you're stuck with the fact that consciousness is a side effect.
I totally agree. So what I would ask you, thank you for articulating. I mean, so you have two moves here, right? You can preserve these arguments as modus ponens arguments of some kind, right? And then say I've got to rejig it, or why not say it's modus tollens? There must be something fundamentally wrong with all the arguments, like Mary's rule, because precisely if they're leading to these deeply implausible, absurd, paradoxical conclusion, you should take. I take that as evidence. There must be something fundamentally wrong with the arguments.
Yeah, I think the way I address the point where I put the issue exactly is in our conceptualization of physical entities as being I don't want to say unconscious because it's sort of begging the question, but the way
you're struggling with language. I hope you feel I'm trying to be charitable with you.
Oh yeah, it's good. Yeah, you're asking good questions. It's great. What I mean is, if you look at and say the way people would generally talk about physical entities, if you ask a physicist or a high school student who's doing physics and so on, and you ask them, well, you can look at a human being as a set of fundamental particles following these laws, and do you think that this particle is what do you think this fundamental particle is? And the general idea we have, the conceptualization we have, is, well, it's sort of like the matter we see generally, where it's dead, it's inert, it's it has no consciousness there at all. And if you have that conceptualization of matter, then you are led to the paradoxes I am talking. You must accept, I think, the 5 arguments.
Sure.
But so because you are ultimately led to paradoxes, where I choose to put if you get to a contradiction, you can reject one of your premises, and the premise I will reject is the idea that matter is like what we tend to. Like how we tend to conceptualize it as that matter, like the macroscopic matter we see, but that it's unconscious at those levels, and then you get all of those problems.
Okay, so I mean, I'm not sure if that's the same thing that I'm going to say. My response is, because this is a direct response, because what you do is you have to. I think you regard as a modus tollens, which is to reject the central premise, which is the two entities can differ in their qualia and be functionally identical. Like, why not say? Are you saying that ultimately at some level they're functionally non-identical, or like what does it mean to say? So if I reconceive of matter, and the two of them are still functionally identical, it seems to me, right, that the problem still remains. How does the problem change by reconceiving of matter?
Well,
as long as they're functionally identical, then these hidden properties still make no functional difference, and that's the core of the epiphenomenalism, right?
Well, I do. There are a few responses that are possible. I think one is a more pessimistic answer is to say that, well, we will never know, and this is getting to one of your other points, that maybe we will never know exactly what those
inner properties are. Yeah.
Are exactly, but one thing we know is that we cannot play with them like the 5 arguments, that there is something intrinsic to those entities that must be akin in some ways to consciousness.
So that's the part I don't get. Why can't it be symmetrical? Why can't it be
symmetrical?
That it's just that I have intrinsic properties of me that are unknowable to me. I mean, my consciousness seems accessible to me. So it seems to be precisely different than these unknowable properties in matter. It seems to me that my unknown, I mean, this is Harman's position. My unknown properties are as unknown to me as the unknown properties of the mug. Well, that's a symmetrical argument, as far as I can see.
Well, it's possible that that the real nature of those entities is very different from our properties. Maybe like that's something that Russellian monism would say, that maybe they're different. But still, I think it's a good, at least. I mean, there are other arguments why you would. I guess it's similar to the deep continuity argument you mentioned earlier. Although I don't know it that well, but I guess I can mention at least one, which is the evolution of consciousness. That if there is nothing like our consciousness in matter, then you have a big problem in explaining how it is that the first bit of consciousness appeared in the phylogenetic tree. Why is it that at some point in the universe there was just matter, totally unconscious, maybe with their intrinsic nature, but totally different from consciousness, and at some point in all that universe, consciousness appeared.
Okay.
And that's an issue.
Okay, that's a definite problem. So can we respond to each argument once?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
And I'm acknowledging you have two, and I'll let you get back to the second one. But I think this is a really important argument. I take the argument about evolution to be a really good one. So I have two things to say to that. One is, again, maybe my inner properties are being alive rather than being conscious. And that might, again, I don't know which one of these is going to turn out to be the right thing. And I have precedent for that. There was a whole generation of people who argued for the that life has being a living thing has an inner essence that can be captured by physicalism. That's vitalism. And the thing is, that has fallen on pretty hard times because we seem to be getting this increasingly good. Just remember and you've heard me say this repeatedly, and this is very important to me. Physicalism is not the same thing as materialism, right?
Yeah. I agree.
Right. Laws aren't. E equals mc squared is part of physics. If anything is part of physics, but E equals mc squared doesn't have a specific location. It doesn't have a body. It's right. So, like to equate materialism and physicalism is unfair to me. So, I know you're not doing that, but I just want to for anybody who might be listening in, because I'm often called a materialist, and that is to just ignore the ontology that I'm actually using. Yeah. Okay. So I take it that many people, and in fact, it's now just in the general public, that we don't think that there's, other than maybe, again, a Russellian monism in which everything, or a Harman, everything has an aspect, which I agree with already, that might be qualitatively beyond our ability to currently frame it, because that's just been the history of our science. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be anything uniquely different about life from other physical processes. I mean, it's self-organizing, it's autopoietic. And so I see that the project of trying to identify the inner nature with life being a living thing has sort of fallen into disuse. I mean, to be fair. And I've seen in my own area, people had tried to make similar arguments about intelligence. We'll never be able to explain how something like intelligence emerges, and yet we're doing it, right? And I mean, maybe I'm begging the question, but you can't beg the question. We seem to be making tremendous progress in artificial intelligence. We wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't the case, right? And the work, and it's happening at an accelerating rate. And that's why, again, the argument about sort of intelligence, how could it possibly have emerged, is also falling into disuse. That's why I think it's almost always consciousness that people. So my thing is, I'm suspicious of this argument because it is structurally similar to the argument about life being an inexplicable fundamental property of things, or intelligence, and those have gone away. And so that's why I'm not confident when anybody picks a particular level of the deep continuity and says, no, that's the property that goes all the way down. Because we've done it before and we've been wrong, right? So we can't make these arguments intuitively because we have clear evidence that the intuitions have gone wrong in the past.
Okay, that's an interesting point, and I guess that's one of the instances where I guess you have to choose your mystery, maybe.
And fair enough, and I mean that. I mean that seriously, JP. I mean, fair enough. Go ahead. Because
I find it, ultimately, if you want to be, I see very much panpsychism as at least a first step away from physicalism, But I don't know exactly with which kind of position you will end up ultimately once you work out all the kinks. Like epiphenomenalism, the paradox of phenomenal judgment, and the problem of the evolution of consciousness. What I think, at least if you want to stay a materialist, a naturalist, apologies, if you want to stay a naturalist, and you want to be a panpsychist, you will have to be committed to some form of Mysterianism, in saying that you will not be able to know precisely, the properties all the way down. You will, there's, I think, I don't know into how much detail it's worth going here, but I think I'll try to stay close to your point. It's I think my best guess is to say that there is something like phenomenal consciousness going all the way down, although it gets simpler and simpler. But if you want to be a naturalist, I think there are other options open, but if you want to stay a naturalist, you have to say that, well, I'm never going to be able to know that satisfyingly, how the consciousness, there's something I could say there, how the phenomenal consciousnesses of, let's say, atoms and molecules are. It will have to be very simple, but it's very hard to imagine. And there's the further problem knowing how they combine, and those are big issues, but I'm willing to make that trade-off if it means that there is a deep continuity in the evolution where consciousness doesn't just appear out of nowhere. And if I can say that I'm not just matter, but I still get to act, there's a bunch of things I get if I'm willing to accept that mystery and still being a naturalist. Ultimately, I'm not that committed to naturalism, but there is, I guess that's a mystery I'm willing to take. I guess I like the trade-off. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, my response to that, and again, I'm not claiming that I don't have a mystery somewhere either. I'm not making that claim. That's arrogant, and I'm so granted.
I agree.
Okay, but I think my issue is where, I mean, what you might be called between strong and soft, or strong and weak. That's not meant to be pejorative. It's used in AI, strong and weak AI. It's used when people talk about emergence, strong and weak emergence, where strong means you're sort of contravening naturalism in some way, and weak means you're not, right? Not in a strong and weak AI, that's a different thing. But so I hear that ultimately the form of panpsychism you're arguing for asserts not continuity, which I've said I agree with, but identity all the way down.
What do you mean?
So there's a difference between identity and continuity, right? Identity would be would be that the set of necessary and sufficient conditions for being X are shared all the way down, right? That's what makes things identical.
So in this instance, for being conscious, you mean?
Yes, yeah. Whereas the deep continuity says, no, being conscious and being alive share necessary features, but not all. So it's a continuum argument rather than a discrete identity argument. So it's not an equivalency argument. It's a continuum argument, like the way orange overlaps with yellow and blah, blah, all the way. And that doesn't mean that the two ends of the spectrum are the same hue at all. Although there's overlapping, there's necessarily overlapping properties all the way along.
Okay.
Right. So right. And it seems to me that if, and it's not guaranteed, but if you can make a strong case for a deep continuity ontology, then you precisely have an account of how, right, you can get emergence of something like mind out of purely sort of physical. You get it via the deep continuity. Now, what I think that's important to me because it's trying to incorporate right into the ontology what is the fundamental difference between the consciousness and intelligence I have and whatever it is that the mug has, right?
Yeah.
Right. And then secondly, and this goes to the fourth point, I'm explaining my choice. That's what I'm trying to do. I choose deep continuity precisely because it gives me a clear account for how participatory knowing can work, and therefore how I can be very deeply connected and sort of how I can get back a contact epistemology. And so I have a very clear argument there. I gave it to you. And that's why I choose that, because it precisely is a choice that I can make with an intellectual integrity, being consistent. But one of the advantages I see of it is that it precisely gives me an account. It gives me an ontological grounding of participatory knowing, And I think participatory knowing, at least at the psychological level, because we got good evidence for that, is what is missing when people are experiencing a meaning crisis. So
Okay.
that's my reason for choosing that way.
Okay. Oh, that's very good. That's very nice, because in the end, yeah, I think now that I understand your position better, especially because I have read some Evan Thompson and some on the literature, some of the literature on activism in general, but I hadn't understood the deep continuity argument as well as you just put it. And ultimately, as I was saying, that I think Panpsychism is a good step away from physicalism, and then you have to work at all the kinks and end up somewhere. And the version of Panpsychism I'm most sympathetic to is the one coming from Henri Bergson, French philosopher.
I've read Bergson. It was one of the joys of my undergraduate to sit underneath a tree in a very warm spring day and read from cover to cover the Introduction to Metaphysics and the whole idea of DeRay. And by the way, just to buttress your argument, I think of DeRay as a good candidate for sort of the Russellian monism, that things have DeRay in a way that it's very difficult to capture with the formal systems that are often being used in the mathematics. So I will grant you that. Okay.
That's good, because that's sort of what I have in mind when I talk about phenomenal consciousness. It's something when I talk about the identity, to take back your argument, or the continuity, is that I think you have to, and that's something that Bergson I think said explicitly at a few places, that things have duration all the way down in the way that we do. So, but it was. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I can't remember the exact quote, especially since it's in French anyway. But he said that. But he said that if you try to imagine, let's say, if you take the fundamental ground of matter, at the lowest level you can think of, and you will have to be committed to the idea that those things have duration, but we must not anthropomorphize it, thinking that they have something that is very close to our consciousness. We must rather imagine sort of the minimal duration DeRay required for those things to go from one moment in time to another. And
that's problematic, right? Because there's versions of quantum physics that says there is no that time itself is quantized. And
that's something that Bergson sort of predicted, right? Because
and Hahn talks about it too. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, I was just gonna say that. Sorry, I cut you off. I just get too enthusiastic when I think.
I've cut you off multiple times too. So. The thing is, we're both being charitable and we're both being polite, and we're taking each other seriously. That's all that really matters. So as long as we just keep playing this game the way we're doing it, I'm satisfied. I hope you are.
Yeah, I'm very happy, because that's the point where the sort of panpsychism I'm most sympathetic with is the one from Bergson. So ultimately.
And just to buttress my point, because I buttressed yours, one of the things that I got from that, much later though, is that Bergson's notion of DeRay gives us a deep kind of participatory knowing, because I think this is the right way to put it, because I am an instance of DeRay. I have a participatory knowing of this is what I think the Bergsonian notion of intuition is. It isn't our normal notion of intuition. It's that I can know the DeRay of this because I know I participate in. It's not just an object of thought. I am DeRay, and therefore I can pick up on the DeRay of this.
Yes.
That's what I mean about if you got a deep continuity, it grounds participatory knowing in an important way. I think that's a fair reading of Bergson.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a very it's a nice point we reached, because we're sort of in agreement. It turns out. So maybe I could try to go back to the other points and talk about how I address it, especially in the version of panpsychism I'm most sympathetic with, namely Bergson's.
Sure.
So in your second argument was about that.
I think it was how do you get the it's the build-up problem, right? The scale-up problem. Yeah. I think, was that my second argument? I'm not sure. I can't remember my order now.
I have notes that my arguments needed not to imply panpsychism, and also are those fundamental properties always inaccessible? Can I access them somehow? And introspection didn't quite do the trick.
Yeah, that's something that. Right.
And that's an interesting point, because especially in analytic philosophy, people always talk about introspection, but I guess
it's not taken seriously that way in psychology, because if you, I mean, here, I think this is a good argument that should make you at least think about. If you take the existence of self-deception to be a real thing, right, then it is also, you know, really possible that people can be self-deceived when they introspect, and they do all the time. People will claim to know things that they don't know. They will claim to believe things that aren't consistent with, like, there's all kinds of things, and people will say, like, and you even have, you know, the blind sight phenomena, which is, by the way, another argument for the explanatory gap. I guess that's the sixth argument.
Yeah.
In which, and so if you take self-deception to be real, and unless you have an independent argument to show me that introspection is safe from, metaphysically safe from, self-deception, then introspection should also fall prey to self-deception.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess instead of introspection, then I would talk more about phenomenological investigation in the way that, you know, Bergson did it or the phenomenologists did it, because I think is that something you're more sympathetic with?
Yes.
With all the whole enactivism.
Very much. Very much.
So I guess that's the quick answer to that point. Oh yeah, and the third point was basically the combination.
Let me make sure I understand this. You're saying that, I mean, are you claiming that I do phenomenological analysis and that's what gives me access to my inner properties, or I can do phenomenological access and that gives me access to consciousness? Because the point of my argument was I didn't see the bridging argument, right?
Okay. So
I need to phenomenologically grasp my consciousness as the intrinsic properties, right? That's what I was claiming. So I'll grant you have this phenomenological method. It's not just introspection, but what I need to phenomenologically grasp that my consciousness are these intrinsic properties, and I don't know. I don't know if I have that phenomenological ability. Right.
Oh, that's interesting. I have to confess that's something I'll have to think more about. Especially, I had not considered how bad introspection is, and, you know, what's exactly the difference with phenomenology. I guess my quick intuition is that, so I would have to explain how phenomenologically I can grasp that I'm not just matter, that I'm not just the behavior described by physics, but I have something else.
Right, and that your consciousness fits the role of that something else, because that's what you need for your argument. It seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's, to do justice to this, I think that's something I'll have to think more about. But,
fair enough. That's fair.
Yeah, so the basic idea would be that I would have to see how, I would have to contrast the fact that I imagine I have a set of laws which explain my behavior, why I go and do such and such. And I would have to grasp that, by phenomenological investigation, my real reason is this desire or that desire, and the clash between the two would be sufficient to establish the difference.
Maybe. I mean, let me try and give you what I think you would need to do. There's a group of people, you've invoked them, the New Mysterians, you McGinn and others, right? And what they precisely argue is there is not only phenomenological, they argue that they have no phenomenological grasp of their qualia that gives them any kind of conceptual bridge to the physical. So I take it that they're claiming that not only do they not have what I'm asking from you, a phenomenological grasp of how consciousness is the inner properties in matter, but they claim it's not even possible. So what I'm saying is you'd need a response, I think, to them. So that's what I'm arguing.
Okay, to them. Oh, well, I think Bergson has this to some extent, and I think this will even start answering your third point, which the third point was about, in panpsychism, you seem to have the same problem as the mind-body problem. You need to explain how the lower level properties can give rise to the higher level properties, and it seems.
And I think the hidden premise in there is you're going to invoke emergence. And if you invoke emergence, then I can just stick emergence into my deep continuity, and then I've got I got what I need. So I want to make the argument stricter. You need to do this without invoking emergence.
And that's one of the reasons why I like Bergson. I think if you the best theories on offer to solve those problems in panpsychism, in the analytic philosophy literature, is I think a sort of Mysterianism, that you need to be committed to this. But with Bergson, Bergson gives us access to maybe not the entire, in some places it seems to give us access to the whole range of those properties, but at least maybe one way to see it closer to us is that we can sort of get in touch with the durée of things that are lower levels and higher levels. Maybe one example, I get two examples I kind of like is to, one thing for Bergson is that when we make a choice, our durée becomes longer. We can make choices in the future, and we sort of condense lower durée into a higher durée. So when, let's say, I think a good example is when I'm writing something. At the moment when I'm not sure what I'm going to write, my consciousness is very sort of wide, large. There's my screen, there's the feeling of my chair in my back, there's sound I'm hearing, there's a bunch of stuff, and my durée is pretty short. So I'm not thinking like 10 seconds into the future. It's fairly short, but at the moment where I know what I will write, there's sort of a flash where, okay, I know what I'm going to write in this paragraph. At this moment, there's sort of a lot of stuff which fades away. I'm not as conscious as, let's say, the sensation of my chair, maybe the room, but I know what I'm going to type, let's say 5-10 seconds into the future. So this is a point where, so we condense durée, and conversely, points where we cannot make choices, at places where we cannot make choices, we can feel our durée sort of fragment. Let's say we have a car accident. Maybe you're driving normally, you're thinking about what you're going to do in the next few seconds, let's say, but you have a car accident, and all of a sudden your consciousness sort of really fragments. There are different systems which are engaged with, are panicking about such and such. You feel your heartbeat, you feel a bunch of stuff, and at this moment your consciousness becomes very short temporally. So at least with this sort of phenomenological investigation, we can bridge at least part of the gap away from us and towards higher or lower level properties. And Bergson thought that I don't know if he really could do it, but he said that we can go pretty low. I don't think he said sort of all the way down, but we can bridge that gap pretty low, according to him.
So I think that's good, but maybe my interpretation of Bergson is different here than you, or maybe my response to Bergson. Maybe you have a more accurate interpretation, but here's maybe where I respond to him and differentiate myself from him. So I take there's sort of two things here. There's our DeRay and there's our psychological experience of our DeRay. And I took DeRay to be I took DeRay to be something that is, there is an aspect of our being that is inherently temporal in a way that is not captured by our normal concept of time, that there's ultimately something mysterious about time. And I mean, that goes back to Augustine. I know what time is until you ask me. Time is something I can only know in a participatory fashion, because I can never get outside of time to look at it. And so I take it that there's something. So I took DeRay to mean the ontological mystery, or at least maybe it's a theoretical mystery. I don't know. It's okay. I'll be very cautious. I took DeRay to be an aspect of time that is always phenomenologically, and I would say also maybe even conceptually, mysterious to us, and so I'm fine with that. But again, to say that DeRay is the same thing as the way my sense of future and past are opening up, that I don't see.
I'm not sure about the last point.
Okay, so
how does it relate?
So I take it that there's see, this is what I'm trying to. I take it there's nothing I can do to alter my DeRay, precisely because I think if it's a sort of a fundamental building block of realness, I don't think that psychological manipulations can alter it. I think what can alter is how I'm representing, because Bergson clearly thought there was a difference there, how I represent it, and how I conceive of it, how I experience it. And so I'm saying that I can see my experience of DeRay and my representation of DeRay can be dramatically affected by my psychological behavior in the same. I don't see how that actually alters the DeRay itself, because presumably the DeRay is a fundamental property shared by all things, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I kind of agree with you. There's just a few details I'll try to add here and there.
Sure.
That we can let's say about knowing we can, it's hard to say. Different things have different durée. You know, consciousness can have shorter or longer durations. I'm not sure I should say consciousness, because for Bergson, durée is almost the same thing as consciousness, or at least in our case. But
which is of course problematic. That's why I sort of read Bergson the way I read it to you, right? Because because I want to avoid that equivocation.
It's kind of funny. There's a lot of articles in philosophy of mind which start by mentioning that consciousness is a mongrel concept. It's sort of it's too bastardized. So I guess it's better if we just stick to duration, because we can sort of equivocate the two, but then you don't mean consciousness. You don't mean by consciousness the same thing as many other people. So let's just stick to durée. When I think Bergson was talking about sort of plunging or diving into durée. It's something you have to act. When you try to conceptualize durée, he said you're trying to sort of turn it into space, like physics does, and you cannot do this. He said,
I grant that, and I think that's a mistake, because we're trying to jump out of time into space, etc.
So when I talk about affecting our duration, it's something that we have to do. It's not sort of a concept. When I know higher or level durations, it's by doing it, sort of by making choices, or being fragmented. That's how I can experience the low. It's sort of a contact, I guess, you get with the lower or higher level durations. And
so I could see that. I could see that my cognitive processes, I'm trying to use a neutral term because we're avoiding consciousness, could give me different degrees of access to different not domains, that was exactly the wrong word, I apologize, different levels or scope of DeRay, right? So I might have a level of DeRay that, right, is like, shared by sort of all things. And then there might be processes that don't have the same DeRay. The problem that I have with that, and maybe you've wrestled with this problem too, because you probably have thought about Bergson more than I have. It's been a while since I thought about Bergson. The problem I always had is when you start talking about length of DeRay, it starts to sound like he's attributing a spatial property to it, right? It's like it lasts this long. He sounds like he's quantizing it, which is something
which he doesn't want to do.
Right? Exactly. And so the way I reconcile that is, well, he admits that we quantize in our conceptions of DeRay, and I think and he also clearly believes that we can have better, more or less adequate conceptions of DeRay that can bring us sort of closer to it, right? Or alienate us more from it. And I take it that that's what he's talking about when he's talking about all this manipulation of DeRay. He's not actually talking about we're altering the phenomena. We're altering our conception of it, and therefore how adequately we are, to use your language, in contact with it or not.
Well, I'm not sure I see exactly how you disagree with Bergson, or maybe it's the last bit you mentioned where I guess one way I'll try to rephrase it is there are different rhythms of duration. I know that's something that Bergson talked about, where different things have different durée. Like the fundamental particles, let's say, have very short durée. That's why they're so simple. That's why they don't do much. Whereas us, we have much longer durée. When we talk of longer, it's as you said, I guess it's a conceptualization we use to talk about it, but language will never do justice to it. Something we have to live, and that's something that Bergson wrote. So I think
Malinowski even has a book very much allied with Bergson called Lived Time, where he talks about that there's an aspect of time that can only be grasped by being a living thing. Okay, sorry, I'm still not quite getting it. So I'll grant you that we're maybe even using this language, right? I don't take it. Let me give you what I'm thinking. I don't take it that when I manipulate various forces, I'm using this as an analogy, like when I manipulate electromagnetism, that I'm actually changing the nature of electromagnetism in any way. All I'm doing is altering, right, the particular form it's having. And what I'm saying is, so there aren't different electromagnetisms, right? There are different ways in which electromagnetism presents itself. It seems to me And that's how I was understanding DeRay, but by analogy, right? I can sort of, I can, if you'll allow me this language, it's clumsy, but we're both admitting the language is clumsy here, right? If by my cognitive behavior, I can manipulate the instantiation, the particular form that DeRay takes, but I'm not actually changing DeRay.
Okay, I think I'm getting, I think I get an idea of what the crux of the issue here is, and I think it has to do with the fact that it's best not to see Bergson as a naturalist, and this goes with the idea of not being able to, make the parallel between DeRay and electromagnetism, because there are, I think Bergson talks about tensions between different levels of duration. So it's like, if you look at electromagnetism, if you know what is happening at the lowest level of electromagnetism, all of the other levels follow. That just if you know what happens with electromagnetism at the fundamental level.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, because it depends what you mean. I mean, the electrons will still behave as electrons at a higher level, but they can be empowered constituent elements of systems that have properties that the So I'm invoking emergence, right? Right?
In a weak sense.
Yes, in the weak sense, totally.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'll phrase it in a more aggressive way to make the point clear.
That's fair, and I'll receive it in good spirit.
It's with So at least if you knew what goes on at the lowest level with electromagnetism, you could predict, or the better way to say it, it's the higher levels, even if they're emergent, they won't break the causality at the lower level. There's no real tension there.
They won't violate any of the principles operating, but they can be emergently different. Let me get
I think I agree.
Okay, I just want to make clear, whether or not this is right, metaphysicists would say, standard models of causation that are clearly applicable at the upper levels are not applicable at the quantum level. And so, that means there isn't a direct predictive relationship between causal structures and the quantum level, which is part of the difficulty of trying to reconcile a macrocosmic theory like relativity with a microcosmic theory like quantum mechanics.
Okay, that's good. I agree with that. And so that's a weak form of emergentism. But with Bergson, there's a strong form of emergentism at every time that there's a new level of duration. So when I think maybe a clear way to see it would be to take an example. It's not something I took from Bergson. It's something I read in a book about someone who wrote about Bergson, Milish Capek, I think that's the way you pronounce his name.
I've heard the name actually.
He's a good philosopher of science, and especially he has done good work on Whitehead and on Bergson.
I'm interested also very much in Whitehead and that relationship. Please continue.
So a good example he mentions is if you were to look at, let's say, the level of the fundamental particles of your brain, let's say, and you were trying to predict all the probabilities of what would happen when you do such and such an action, and at the moment where you make a decision in your DeRay at your level, if you make a decision and you were to look at what happens at the lower level when you make your decision, this would break the probability laws of, it would be very improbable at the level of physics. And if you were to repeat it, it would become more and more improbable. So let's say something which had a certain chance of happening, let's say 50% of the time at the level of your fundamental particles, but you make the choice to do it, in the first time, it's 50-50, nothing impressive. But if you choose to do it repeatedly, every time it's, let's say 50%, and it becomes more and more unlikely. So you can break the probability laws of physics at the fundamental level when a higher level of duration makes choices.
Okay, well, first of all, that's to put the choice outside the causal thing, which might be begging the question. But let me respond in a different way. So, and this is where I would break with a standard naturalist and go with people that are in 4E cog sci, people like Evan Thompson and others, because we think the structure, and we think naturalists should be committed to this, by the way, and I would argue this. We are committed to the idea that the structural functional organization of things makes a difference. Now, it doesn't make a difference by being causally emergent. It makes a difference I think if we make these arguments in the series, it's not about causal events. It's about sets of constraints that shape the possibility. And so downward causation is the wrong way to put it. But the way of putting it is structural functional organization. And it's kind of like on analogy with like the curvature of space, right? It's not an event, it's not a cause, but what it does is it constrains the possibility space for which things can happen. And that's how it alters the probabilities of things going all the way down. And again, I think that is completely implicit in the sort of a scientific naturalistic world, because you have to explain things like why things follow laws, right? And I agree with Morton and others that laws are not just descriptions of regularity. They're for sort of deep metaphysical reasons. You have to think of them as constraints on your possibility. They if you'll allow me this metaphor, they shape pure possibility into definite structures of potentiality. And so again, this is what I mean when I think we need, in addition to a weak emergence, we need something like a weak emanation in the sense that possibility is being structured in a downward way. I'm not totally comfortable with these metaphors, but in a downward way by the structural functional organization of things. And again, I think that can be made, or at least I'm trying to indicate, in a way that's completely consistent with your physics. And the reason is I need that for everything. I don't need that just for how minds emerge. I need that for how this causal thing emerges and persists in the way it does. Because again, you know, if something spontaneously became a mug at the quantum level, that would be a deeply improbable event, right? Right. But the fact that it occurs the way it does, you have to invoke all of this. And here's the final argument for why I think you should be committed to that. Any physicist is relying on information to generate their ontology. The information that they're using is at this level that we're at now, because that's the only level I have access to. If that information is not real information, then it can't give me real information about, right, the deeper level. So this level's...
sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So let's say this is the gauge, and I'm measuring my gauge, and it's telling me what's going on in my gas chamber or something as the particle is moving around, right? If this information is ultimately not real, right? If it doesn't have the power to causally affect as that information, not as its constituent thing, but the whole if the pattern isn't real, then the knowledge that it's generating in me ultimately can't give me access to reality, because it itself is not real. I think there's an implicit argument, right, within anybody who claims that physics gives us access, right, to the unobservable world through these observable patterns, that there has to be a reality to that. And to be fair, again, to me, there are physicists who are proposing, because they're trying to deal with black hole paradoxes and stuff like that, that information is a real property. So that information just isn't, it's not it's contra occam. It's not just a nominalism, that there are real patterns, and that they can really do things. They can really make a difference. And so I think that the position I'm arguing for is consistent with, and even implicit in, a lot of the physicalist worldview. And that's what I would use to try and propose an alternative. I would say, give me weak emergence plus weak emanation, and I don't think I need strong emergence. That would be my response.
Okay. Yeah, the thing, I guess it gets back to a point we discussed earlier about the evolution of consciousness.
Sure.
And an extra reason why I'm willing to grant strong emergence to Bergson at every level is that it gives a good idea why phenomenal consciousness would appear, would be selected by evolution. Is that, you know, every time in nature where the higher level consciousness, the higher level DeRay can make choices, you know, that impact the lower levels. We talk about genuine choice, where it influences, where it goes, where it can do unprovable things at the lower levels. There's a clear evolutionary advantage to
not improvable, unpredictable. There's a difference. I don't think anybody would say that it does something that can't be post hoc explained at the quantum level.
Yeah. I mean, it's statistically improbable.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. So that's a good that's a good way of explaining why evolution would select more and more complex consciousnesses, more and more complex durée, because you can end up with organisms like us who can make choices that are.
Well, but like again,
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say, well, I see the problem I have with strong emergence is the way you get strong emergence, and you're invoking it to a degree. You're saying so weak emergence is that the upper level has properties that the lower level doesn't have. We're in agreement with that, right?
Yeah, I can state it like Bergson would. So it's that the higher level durations are in tension with the lower level durations.
Sure.
So go ahead.
I'm using a more metaphysically broad and I hope neutral idea of properties. So sodium on its own and chlorine on their own are noxious, but salt is a nutrient to us. So salt has nutritious properties that sodium and chloride don't have. And so I'm using that because that's a prototypical example of weak emergence. And what makes it weak emergence is, although everybody acknowledges that the upper level has properties, and I would argue, given my previous argument, they're real properties and not illusory properties, because some people will say, but it's an illusion, right? No. The salt being nutritious is a real property, right? And I gave you my reason for that a few minutes ago. But what makes it weak emergence is we say, but there's an explanatory relationship between the lower level and the upper level. I can give you, a naturalistic explanation of how you get there, right? And so the problem I have is that it seems to me that strong emergence is therefore committed to, well, there's ultimately no explanation of how I can get from the material to the non-material, which is why you're invoking sort of a fundamental property dualism, I think. And so my response to that is, well, that you need to show me how that does better than, well, you know what, evolution will select for self-organizing things over non-self-organizing things. It will then select for autopoietic things rather than just self-organizing things. It will select for, mobile, autopoietic things over just stationary ones. It will select until I can do a chain by chain explanation showing how in each step along the way what the survival advantages would be. Something equivalent has to be on offer.
Okay, I think there's I don't know of a better word than emergentism to talk about this, because the kind of emergentism you find in Bergson is not like the classic versions of strong emergence you'll find generally in philosophy of mind, where, as you said, it's a kind of dualism because there's one strong step. In Bergson, it's very continuous. That at every level, the more the higher duration is more complex than the lower duration. So at every level, you can make new choices. So there's a continuity there, which doesn't lead to the same problems as radical emergence, which only happen. I mean, in a way, it's strange because the fact that it doesn't just happen once makes it sort of smoother. But I agree that it's a big step, and that's, I think, why it's not useful to see Bergson as a naturalist, because at every step where the higher jury can make choices, it becomes less predictable. It's not the same kind of laws that a naturalist would like, where the lower level laws still imply the higher level laws. Maybe there are, you can still have laws with Bergson, but there will be they won't be as closely linked to the lower level laws.
Sure.
But I agree that it's a big step to do. I'm willing to take it because it gives me an explanation of the evolution of consciousness.
Right.
So I'm willing to take that mystery again.
Well, I mean, like I said, I think I have an alternative, and then I would reply to, right. It seems to me that what's doing the explanatory work then in why the upper levels can do things like make choices isn't the presence of the DeRay, it's the presence of the complexity. And it's the emergent complexity that's giving you because I take it that you said, I'm capable of choice in a way that the things at the bottom aren't, which takes us back to that issue. Is like, well, so I have a cognitive ability and maybe a consciousness ability, certainly an intelligence ability that the lower levels don't have. And so and that seems to me like the problem we started with. Well, how do those get there when they're not at the bottom level? And you seem to be invoking complexity is what's actually doing the work. But if you give me that, and if you give me complexity being able to generate emergent, then I can plug it into deep continuity. Because that's exactly what I did when I went from self-organization to I kept ramping up the orders of complexity.
Yeah, but what Bergson allows me to do is to explain not just the complexity of the actions, but as well the complexity of the higher level consciousnesses. That allows me to see why, and that's the big thing.
How does it do that? I mean, so that's the point that, and I'm not trying to be obtuse. I mean, I don't see how it does that, because if it offers an explanation, right, of lower things in terms of higher things, isn't that going to be exactly logically, that's too strong, structurally isomorphic to the same argument I'm making, right, where I can explain lower levels and higher levels because of complexity?
Well, I would argue that you still get the issue of why at the high level of your consciousness, let's say, I want to explain why this consciousness, which is so complex, exists, in why this has been selected in addition to all your functional organization properties. I can explain, I agree with your weak emergence, where you can explain, you can use higher level phenomena as constraints on the lower level phenomena. I agree with that. But then I still have, we're coming back to the beginning of our discussion, where I think you get the issues of the 6 arguments against physicalism we mentioned. Why is this system, why does it have a phenomenal consciousness?
But that's exactly where I can't get the evolutionary argument to work, because my response is, right, the 6 arguments seem to conclude that qualia are functionally inert. They make no functional difference. And evolution can only select on functional differences. That's exactly how the theory works. If 2 things are functionally identical, evolution cannot select between them. And so that seems to me to preclude, if you're relying on the 6 arguments, that seems to me to preclude any possible explanation of how evolution produced it.
I agree. That's a good point. I can't just go back to those points. I have to say that there is, I can't rely on the arguments like 100%. I have to do the same thing I did later in the beginning of our conversation of saying that, well, it indicates that there's an issue in how we conceptualize things, at least, how we conceptualize matter. The fact that we can imagine those things shows that there's an issue there. But if you take that conception of matter, which was the issue, I can conceptualize, your system of, with your higher level constraints on lower level constraints. I can conceive of this materially. I can,
physically, please.
Sorry. So I can conceive of this physically. I can see why this physical system would evolve, why the high level constraints are, have impacts on the lower level constraints. But I need, a step to explain.
Okay, so then I just, this is a clarification question, right? Would you allow the model? Can it explain life?
Your system?
Yeah,
I agree.
And can it explain the? It can explain the evolution of life. Can it explain the evolution of intelligence?
I'm willing to say that. I don't know if it did in practice. But because of other arguments, maybe if Bergson is right, then there's more than just this physical system. There are DeRays which are impacting. But I agree that your system can explain it. Yeah.
Okay, so so then now we're into sort of our competition of intuitions, which I grant, and I've granted this throughout.
Yep.
And then I've tried to, and you have your reasons for your intuitions, and you've articulated them. And then I've tried to say, well, precisely because people have made these arguments about life and intelligence, and then they have disappeared, I'm suspicious of those arguments being extended to consciousness. And that's, maybe this is the point we're going to get to, where we, like, our intuitions are just, you've articulated your reasons for your intuitions, and I've articulated mine. And perhaps that's where we're maybe at sort of a fundamental ontological impasse. And I am willing to say that my suspicions aren't the same thing as a knockdown argument against your position. I cleanly admit that right now. I'm saying something complimentary. I think your position is ultimately intellectually respectable, whereas I think there are other positions where that I wouldn't give them that praise. I would say, no, right? You haven't justified your position. So I'm willing to extend that. I guess the weak conclusion I'm coming to is I am convinced, for the reasons I articulated, that my position is also equally intellectually
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I guess that's a cool point that's a good segue into the last point. You talking specifically about the meaning crisis.
Crisis,
Because
yes.
ultimately, I don't need to have a specific position I'm 100% certain of to be able to address the meaning crisis. I just need all the possible answers to lead to a solution to the meaning crisis, or at least partially. And I think, let's say I'm very sympathetic to Bergson. I think, on let's say let's say 50% of the time I'm in agreement with Bergson, and that's how sort of I see the world.
Sure.
There are other days when I'm more of a Thomist, where I think that's also a viable solution. Something we talk about another time. And I also I'm very sympathetic to your position as well. The thing is, I guess because your position and mine is different enough. Yeah. Before that, because if I take, let's say, the Bergsonian position and Thomism, I think those two sort of can fit together, and they both lead to something that is similar in practice, because Bergson nearly converted to Catholicism at the end of his life.
Sure.
And you can find, you can fit in especially the Catholic tradition if you agree with Bergson. You can obviously fit in the Catholic tradition if you agree with Thomism. So in practice, I end up with similar positions, with my possible worldviews. What's interesting, I think, is more the tension between, let's say, the panpsychism we talked about and your position, where I guess the options are different. Because it's simple for me. It's basically Catholicism. It can fit very well. Whereas for you, you branch off into a very different path.
Okay, well, there's two things about that. Like I said, I don't think I tried to give a response to that where I said, there's nothing intrinsic to things possessing mental properties that solves the meaning crisis. That argument, I think, is a non sequitur argument. So now I get a better sense. You think the panpsychism provides a bridge to something like Thomism, and then the machinery of Thomism has a response to the meaning crisis in it. Is that a fair way to respond to?
Yeah, especially I think panpsychism with Thomism can be very useful. I think it can benefit both positions, because I guess that could be a long argument to make, but with the advantage with panpsychism, generally panpsychism is thought to imply a process theology, where there is a God that exists, but he's sort of a big process.
Yeah, it's often. I mean, that's why Bergson and Whitehead are often linked together. Whitehead is the classic process theologian. Yeah,
and that's the really cool thing about process theology is that it links you to that higher process in a very clear way. It's clear why you should pray to it, let's say, because you can be open to this consciousness so that it acts over you in the same way that you act over yourself, let's say. So it gives you a very direct link to God in this way. But there is a further step you can make. You can still apply, I think, Thomistic arguments, scholastic arguments to talk about. I think you can invoke, let's say, the Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God within a panpsychist system. So I can bridge the gap. So I can get sort of the best of both worlds, I guess, in my system. Because as you said, panpsychism by itself, you can still be miserable. And that's something I mentioned in my talk with Paul. Even if, let's say, you're a panpsychist and you have been able to.
I hope you don't think I was misrepresenting you.
No, it's good. It's good. I just want to restate the point. It's even if you manage to solve in a way the hard problem of consciousness by adopting panpsychism, there's still the possibility that, let's say, your mind is very idiosyncratic, that you're miserable, that you're very different from other people. And the specific issue that was very strong for me was that maybe our consciousnesses are so idiosyncratic that there's nothing objective about our phenomenal consciousness. Maybe what I think is good or evil is just, it depends on what I am, depends on what I eat, and so on. So that you still get nihilism, you still get the meaning crisis. You need further steps to show that not only is consciousness real, that there's a deep continuity between you and the world. You also need to explain why there is still like real objective morality that exists, why this meaning is not subjective, why you're connected with other people, with the world, and so on. And those are further steps that I think you can start with panpsychism and do all of those things and get a meaningful existence.
All right, so a couple of responses. I mean, I am also in, like I said, I've indicated a sympathy with Bergson, but I don't link it specifically to Thomism. I think that, as I mentioned, I can link it to the deep continuity, and then the deep continuity gives me the participatory knowing. I suppose that's where we would then get into a different discussion, which is, I mean, I've tried to present a whole set of historical arguments that undermine the worldview that Thomas Aquinas was committed to. And so for all of those reasons, I find, you know, I put the Thomistic worldview into a serious, you know, question. And then what I'm trying to do is say, well, can given deep continuity and participatory knowing, and given all of the psychology of what people are actually looking for when they're looking for the three orders, can I get that out of a naturalistic account? Because then I can do that without having to tackle, because I think almost all of these historical arguments, although they're internal to a particular philosopher, they are largely the history of the emergence of naturalism as a dominant position. And so I guess that's where I would reply there. I would say, well, I think I can avoid all of that. And I don't mean in a cowardly sense, I mean in a philosophically astute sense. I can avoid all of that if I just try and use the machinery I have and build an account of how people can lead meaningful lives. And the advantage that has, right, is I can put that directly into experimental testing. I can come up really directly with interventions that will help people pedagogically, therapeutically. So it's not just an intellectual reason, it also has sort of moral and ethical empowerment for me, which is also important.
Yeah, I agree that it's more convincing. It will be more convincing to most people if you can stay in the naturalist framework. That's actually, as I mentioned, with my zombie nightmares in the talk with Paul, I got to already a pretty good position by still being a naturalist, while I wasn't, in full agreement with Bergson. I was a panpsychist, and then I was able to, especially with your work and Jonathan Haidt's work, and also Jordan Peterson's work, to see how we're not just stuck in our heads, how we're connected to the world, and how morality is something that it's objective. It's not something that is stuck in our mind. It's something we construct with the world. It's something we have to test. And with this, that fits within a naturalistic framework. And my life was already much more meaningful. I guess the step that, and then I initially started going to church because as a way to develop virtue. I wasn't that that convinced.
Pascal's go to church and light a candle, and then eventually you'll come to believe in God, for sure.
That's sort of what happened. You talk with Thomas long enough, and you start to agree with him. But
I mean, I've read a lot of Thomas. I've read a lot of the Summa Theologica. I see that, and you know that it's deeply important to me to not trespass on people's idiosyncratic, and I don't mean that as an insult. I just mean it neutrally. People's idiosyncratic pathway to how they've gotten a more meaningful life, because I'm just deeply ignorant of all kinds of factors that are at work in you, and so I'm not trying to bully you in any way. And so I see that could be that could happen. I know that could happen. I've seen it happen in other people's lives. But I guess what part of what motivates me in the meaning crisis is I also see very clearly, and I have a lot of demographic evidence that just doesn't work for people. That pathway isn't available to them. And so again, I'm trying to, and I include myself in that. And don't forget, I think I can give an account of a way that doesn't explain away, but it explains the richness of mystical experiences, self-transcendence, all of those things. So it's not some sort of flat ontology by any means. And so because myself and many people find that return non-idiosyncratically viable, if I can coin a horrible phrase, that's why that's the moral reason. That's not an epistemic reason, of course, but that's the moral reason why I'm sort of committed to this path that I'm committed to.
I totally agree with your project. I think it's a very valuable, virtuous project. I guess in several ways, I've been lucky to be able also to find a church where I could discuss those things. I realize that my position is idiosyncratic, that I've been very blessed in this position, and it's not available to all people. Especially it's something with which Paul Vervaeke mentions from time to time, that a lot of people who want to discuss those sort of ideas, they go to a church and it almost never works out well. I agree with you that is for psychological reasons, the path I was able to take is not open to most people, and I agree that your project without going full-blown Christianity is still, very valuable. It's still
Thank you for saying that. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And it was very useful for me. So I mean, I'm very thankful for your project.
Good. I mean, because I'm willing to do this, and it's important to do this. I'm not really committed to, that I know I'm going to convert you to my ontology. That's right. I want to do this. I want to discuss. I want to defend in this amicable, friendly manner, the exploration, and see, and come to see. And I think I really, in a deep, in a way, here's what I'm trying to say. I see your position, and I can find it intellectually respectable, and that's an important thing to do. I think that's a very, very important thing to do.
Yeah, and I think it was a very fruitful discussion. I could say the same thing about your position. I agree. I think it's coherent. It's defensible. We come to a clash of intuitions at some points, as you mentioned, and I think my system is viable. I think your system is viable. Obviously, I prefer mine, or I wouldn't, I wouldn't still hold it. But we're at the point where I don't think the differences are that big. If everyone who is facing nihilism issues was to follow your system, I'd be super happy. I mean, I'd be ecstatic. It's already.
Oh, thank you, thank you very much. Thank you for saying that. And I'm appreciative. I'm trying to be very careful of my words here. I'm appreciative with people who have found a path of religious commitment if they find my work helpful. That is not something. Oh, why are those religious people? Like I'm not a new atheist, right? In that sense. So my position is also ultimately one of non-theism, and I think that's important. Yeah, hearing that it's been helpful to you, and you sincerely believe it would be helpful to other people. Thank you for saying that, because that's extremely gratifying. I mean, I take the meaning crisis. Obviously, I take the meaning crisis very, very seriously, and so trying to address it, I think, is really important. I should go soon, JP.
Yeah. I think it's a good point to end the discussion in any way. Yeah.
That's look. First of all, you're clearly a clear and deep thinker. And so I predict that you're going to have every success in completing. You're not done your PhD yet, are you?
No, I'm doing my master's. I need to fill up a few forms and submit it. I don't know if I want to do a PhD.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you should consider it then. Let me. If you'll allow us to switch hats and me be sort of the old guy. I mean, you're a clear thinker. You're a charitable thinker. You're a great interlocutor. I think you should seriously consider getting your PhD. I can see that, and I mean this as a compliment. It's not a left-handed compliment. I can see there's a lot of ways in which you can deepen your position and you can refine it. And I could easily see that being valuable to many people. So whatever, I mean, again, I'm ignorant of your life story and your life situation and your finances, your time and your relationships, and how psychologically exhausted you might be. So I'm only speaking at a purely pedagogical level, but I wanted to at least say that to you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you as well for the conversation. That was really great, really helpful. I understood lots of new things. And I hope other people we should talk about, maybe if you want to publish it on your channel or on mine, or maybe we can send it to Paul. I don't know.
I think we should it would be very hard for me to directly upload it to YouTube. Okay. If you could upload it to YouTube, and then I'll take it and link it to everything, and we can send a link to Paul, and that way it can get spread to my network and to Paul's network. How about we do it that way? So as soon as you've uploaded it, just send me an email, and I'd be happy. And if down the road, if you decide to continue, or even existentially, down the road, you some new thoughts have occurred, and you might. Bouncing them off me might be helpful to you. Then, my schedule's busy, but I mean, I like what you're doing, and so I'd be happy to talk to you again. Is what I'm saying.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, all right. Great meeting you, and thank you for the excellent discussion.
Thank you. Have a good week.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.